Hello, and thank you for joining. My name is Jamie Stoner, and I am a Museum Archives Training Technician at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center here in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. We welcome your questions and comments anytime during the broadcast by using the chat, or you can email them to broadcast@fws.gov. If we don't get to your comments or questions today, we will do our best to follow up with you afterwards. Before introducing today's presenter, I would like to acknowledge that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the unceded ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. While we could not find a full account, we are aware that many peoples traversed, cherished, and lived on this land. They include the Massawomack, Haudenosaunee, Shawnee, and Delaware. As we learn, we better appreciate the good earth on which we work, live, and learn. We pledge to grow and sustain relationships with the Indigenous communities through collaboration on our training, outreach, and youth programs, museum exhibits, and more. We encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lyla June Johnston. Dr. Lyla June Johnston is an Indigenous museum, author, and community organizer of Diné, Cheyenne, and European lineages. Her multi-genre presentation style has engaged audiences across the globe towards personal, collective, and ecological healing. She blends her study of human ecology at Stanford, graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, and the traditional worldview she grew up with to inform her music, perspectives, and solutions. Her doctoral research focused on the ways in which pre-colonial Indigenous nations shaped the large regions of Turtle Island to produce abundant food systems for humans and non-humans. Lyla June, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here. And one of the benefits of having a sheep farm is you take care of all these endangered sheep. One of the drawbacks is the internet is not so good there. So, apologies for my tardiness. We had to do some magic to get things working here. So, I'm so excited to share with you today all about regenerative indigenous land management techniques, regenerative ecosystem design, and how that ties into the ancient food systems of the indigenous peoples of this continent. I'm hoping that this presentation will enlighten, inspire, and broaden your horizons, maybe even shatter what you thought you knew about indigenous peoples and their land management techniques. Hopefully not, but generally speaking, a lot of this knowledge is not well known. So I'm so excited lately to share it with the world in different venues, different places. Before I begin, I just want to introduce myself traditionally because you kind of have to do that if you're a Diné woman. so, yeah, it's Eshik Adoshit and the Esh Nanisht Ejit Khachi in Ishla. Greetings, my kin and my family. I am from the Nanisht Ejit Khachitni clan of the Diné Nation. We are also incorrectly known as Navajo. And your clan you get from your mother. So that's from my mother's line. We're a matrilineal people. So we get our last names from our mothers, not from our fathers. My second clan I mentioned is my father's mother, which is the Tsétsêhéstâhese or the Southern Cheyenne Nation. The third clan I mentioned is my mother's father, which is the Anshihe, the Salt clan of the Diné Nation. The fourth clan I mentioned is I'm of the European descent on my patrilineal line. So I have to say that Akwit ego Diné Anishla. I present myself as a Diné woman in that manner. We are indigenous Diné people to what is now called New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah. Um, but we are definitely trying to bring our knowledge out into the world. So, without further ado, I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to share with you some of these little things I've been obsessing over in my doctoral research. So, This is the sort of the title of the dissertation that I wrote, Architects of Abundance, Indigenous Food Systems and the Excavation of Hidden History. I'm hoping it will inform your land management practices and your agencies, um, not only to show the specific practices that we would do and in many cases still do, but to show you the inner value system that drove these sustainable systems, to show that your value system is equally, if not more important, as your actual strategies and practices of land management. This is a artist rendition of an actual archaeological site in what is now the Florida riverbanks. And this is oyster shells, and this is based off of real oyster middens that we find along the Florida riverbanks. And I love this picture because it just gives you an idea of the abundance that was generated by indigenous food systems. Um, right where y'all are sitting in the Chesapeake Bay, there was a 3,000-year-old oyster fishery. We know through archaeological evidence that indigenous peoples harvested oysters out of Chesapeake Bay for, like I said, 3,000 years straight without any pause in harvesting. And within 300 years, colonial culture has actually destroyed this oyster fishery to less than 1% of its original population. So it's not just a fluke that these oyster populations were sustained for so long. It took very intentional human management, which even the United States of America is not capable of doing. So it took a science and it took a management strategy, and it was very intentional, contrary to popular belief. So the first one I want to get to is the Shawnee chestnut groves. The chestnut forests that were managed by indigenous peoples all the way from Maine down to Georgia were an incredibly important food source for Eastern indigenous peoples. This was as important as corn is for the Southwest nations. It was some of the things that sustained their entire communities. So the chestnut groves, we know through fossilized pollen analysis, were actually sustained for over 3,000 years. And what you can do is you can go to ponds where these groves used to grow, and you can actually see where the pollen has fallen, and you can actually see how long these forests were there for. And so on the left, we have a Cherokee or Tsalagi family next to one of their gigantic chestnut trees that they took care of, arguably for hundreds of generations. Um, and on the right, you see a chestnut tree artist rendition of an old chestnut tree that was allowed to billow out. And that's part of indigenous land management, is spacing the trees and burning in between. That native people used fire as a tool to effectively manage chestnut groves, because when you space out the chestnuts, the disease is much harder to jump from tree to tree. And also, the trees have space to grow. They have abundant sunlight, water, nutrients. They're not competing with so many closely uh, spaced trees. So their immune systems are actually healthier because they have access to the water and minerals and sunlight that they need, so they can resist blights and pests more easily. And of course, when you're burning in between, you're burning a lot of the pests that might bother these trees. So we could tell through fossilized pollen analysis, this line here is marking 3,000 years ago. So this is all coming out of a soil core that was taken from a Kentucky pond. Um, and on the left side, we have time. So the soil core has almost 10,000 years worth of information encoded and embedded within it. Each of these columns represents a different species of pollen that we find throughout time in the soil core. And you can see right around 3,000 years ago, chestnut comes in very strongly and is sustained for 3,000 years until about 1830, when the chestnut blight obliterated over 90% of the American chestnut population. You also see an influx and a steady presence of hickory nut. Also, black walnut comes out of nowhere about 2,300 years ago. So we see also on the right-hand side the fossilized charcoal. This shows that indigenous peoples were burning consistently for 3,000 years straight. There's never a moment in the record where there's not fossilized charcoal present. Um, and we see the correlation of these two things here. So there's also some influx of certain medicinal and uh, edible plant species such as the goosefoot, sunflower, etc. So sumpweed. So what they did was they transformed this place from a what used to be mostly dominated by cedar. They transformed it into a food forest that was full of nut trees and mast trees and edible plants. So I love talking about the chestnuts, partly to as an ode to them, to honor them, because it's hard to find them anymore, very hard to grow them, but also to honor the indigenous management that kept these chestnuts going, obviously, because without indigenous peoples, the whole system collapsed. Okay, we're going to Bolivia now to look at the Baure floodplain aquaculture. Now, the floodplain aquaculture in Bolivia is very powerful because you have really, really rainy seasons, and large, large swaths of land will swell with water. And then in the dry season, the waters will recede. And so these earthen berms that were created by Indigenous Baure Nation would actually capture the water and funnel it into this area, where they would then create pools, and they could actually hold fish that would be caught and funneled into those pools. Along these berms, they would also plant fruit trees, which would attract game animals. So you would have tree fruit and game animals available within the food system, as well as fish. That also would build extensive canals. This is obviously the artist's rendition, but I'll show you the actual photos here soon. The floodplain would consist of different features that were all man-made or woman-made or people-made. Is that they have ring ditches where they could sort of protect certain areas. They'd have these fish weirs, these fish funnels, as well as these reservoirs that would be there. So when the water's funneled in, you could have a perennial year-round supply of fish. Even during the dry season, you've kind of captured them there. You'd have raised fields where you would grow your crops, so that when the water floods in, it doesn't flood over your field because your field is so tall. Also, similarly, settlement mounds where they would build up mounds that they could settle upon, where the rainy season waters would not flood their homes. Also, the causeways and canals, a large network to facilitate transportation through the system. This is all flourishing in the year 1000 up to about the 1500s, when Spanish colonizers pretty much wiped out the population. You also have forest islands that are extremely prolific in different food stuff as well. So what you have is these massive swaths of land being engineered in such a way that they produce prolific abundance, not just for humans, but for other species as well, such as those game animals who would come and eat from the fruit. Apparently, there's a lot of snails like escargot, in the food system, fish, and they would transform this sort of floodplain, which may have not been so biodiverse, into a very abundant system for humans and non-humans alike. Um, the area that was managed was hard to wrap your head around. It's huge. It's this whole black dotted line here, which is about what a fifth of the country of Bolivia had this floodplain aquaculture management going on. So you can only imagine the amount of people power it would take to build these earthen berms, kilometers and kilometers and kilometers worth of them, as well as the canals. This was a highly, highly densely populated area, which runs contrary to the belief that this was that the Americas were sparsely populated before Europeans got here, which is a whole other story of why people say that and the political motives behind that. So, okay, we're going to move on to where I live in the Southwest deserts, where we would plant our crops at the base of small watersheds. And when you do that, you capture every monsoon rain, every pulse of precipitation, which, as you can imagine, in the desert is not very much. You would have it kind of all funneled into one area when you plant your crops in these alluvial fans. And not only do these alluvial fans have the highest level of water concentration because they're at the base of these watersheds, they also have the highest levels of fertilized or soil organic matter, because all of the runoff from the hillsides above, like up here on the right hand side, there's hillside above, has soil organic matter that are going to be flowing down with the water, with the monsoon, to fertilize your crop. So these crops were known to be up to 1,000 years old without ever having to let them fallow for very long at all, because they're constantly being re-injected with fertilizers and irrigation. So this is called dryland farming. A lot of people will build causeways around here, or rather berms, that will essentially capture the water in one place. The water will sink down year after year, and they almost charge this place with water like a battery, such that they could have a year where it doesn't, um, you know, rain at all, and the crops will grow because there's so much water stored in that area of soil, as well as nutrients from the uh, phosphorus and nitrogen that comes down. Um, yeah, so I love that. And it just teaches us to go where nature is already going. You don't need to build your crops in Phoenix and pipe water from the whichever river. If you just go where nature is already flowing, you'll be more respectful and dovetailing with her. Another thing I like to talk about is the Gunditjmara eel farms. This is in Australia, actually. This is an Australian example, but this is a 6,000-year-old eel farm that has recently been named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. And this is a place where the eel swim. I don't know if can you guys see my cursor? Am I just pointing at stuff that you can't see?
We can see your cursor.
Okay, cool. Just check it. Thanks. So the eels will go back and forth from the sea to the freshwater to spawn. They're a catadromous species, meaning they spawn in the uh, in the sea, in the ocean, and then they go back into freshwater to mature. So this is really exciting because on their way up and down, people would kind of regulate where they would flow. They would kind of manage the places that the eel would go. They had little holding ponds, holding pools, and they could actually facilitate the flow of eel from freshwater to saltwater. They keep the whole system clean, right? Because in order for it to work everywhere, from the fresh headwaters to the ocean, has to be clean and suitable for an eel. So they would take care of this huge swath. And this is an eel trap on the right, so you could see an eel would go into that hole and you catch them and then you have dinner. And so although the people would eat these eel, although the people would uh have a little bit of control over where the eel flowed, they had immense respect for the eel. The eel were viewed as their equals, the eel were viewed as their counterparts, and they would really have a kinship type of sentiment with the eel. And so, even though they would eat them, there was a covenant, or a spiritual contract, that if you feed our people as Gunditjmara people, then we will take care of your homeland. We will make sure you have rivers to swim in. We will make sure that your young can proliferate. We will make sure that your habitat has food for your young to eat and to grow and to experience life as well. And so it's a very reciprocal relationship. And the important part here is this is a 6,000-year-old indigenous farm. It really flies in the face of the notion that all agriculture started in the Fertile Crescent, and the notion that indigenous peoples are not cultivators; they're just hunter gatherers. All of that needed to be re-washed and washed clean, and say, no, we have cultivated, we have created, and we are intentional about this, and we are actually ecosystems engineers. And most of colonial culture doesn't want to admit that, especially in the 1600s and the 1700s, when they were trying so hard to paint us as savages who are not worthy of our own lands, because we didn't use them properly, quote unquote. So all of this has political motivation as to why you would want to muffle the ingenuity, the innovation, the intentionality of indigenous food systems, because you would want, if you're 1600s 1500s colonial culture, and you want access to these indigenous lands, you're going to want to paint them as savage and incompetent as possible, which was one of the popular reasons that colonial culture would use to say, that native people were not worthy of their lands. Also, it's important to note that John Locke, Thomas More, the early people and lawyers and philosophers of their time, they were really trying to talk about private property and how to own land. And what they said was, nobody owns land, only God created it. But if someone labors, if someone plants and sows and plows and puts their energy into it, then that energy was theirs. So in that case, that land becomes theirs. As soon as they put their energy into it, it becomes their private property. So the notion that if you use it, you own it was very strong in colonial culture at the time. So it was really important to ignore how indigenous peoples were actively using and cultivating and putting their own energy into the land, because by their own laws, that meant that this land belonged to indigenous peoples. And if they could say they didn't cultivate it intentionally, then technically it wasn't theirs and they were just quote unquote wasting it. So that's a little thing that we often forget about in colonial history, which was based on Roman law, actually. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating how and why this knowledge was muffled in the historical record. Okay, going back to America. So the grasslands pyro management, as many of you have probably dipped your toe in or maybe are very involved in, one scientist published the following excerpt. He said, "The Illinois Confederacy shaped and altered much of this region as an anthropogenic creation. Like many other indigenous groups in North America, their most important tool was fire. Burning the prairies, they made the grasses hospitable for grazers and managed prairie as a game reserve to maximize productivity." So the Illinois Confederacy was basically a survival group of all the indigenous nations of that area of Illinois, who survived the epidemics and who survived the massacres, kind of joined together to create the Illinois Confederacy. Again, they wiped out about 98% of indigenous peoples, usually within the first century of contact. So usually the survivors of all these tribes would get together and form a new tribe, such as you know, a lot of the tribes we know today are survival bands, groups of people who got together after their parent cultures were nearly obliterated. But the Illinois Confederacy still had this burning practice despite many of their ancestors being gone. Um, so what he means by burning the prairies, making it hospitable for grazers is, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, or maybe telling you something you already know, but when you burn, you keep the saplings and the shrubs from overtaking the ecosystem. You keep the grasslands healthy. And when you don't burn, you have these thickets of shrubs and forests start to encroach. And when you burn, you open meadow. And who likes meadow? Who likes nutrient dense grasses that are nourished by ash, but herbivores like buffalo, antelope, even species of sheep and goat that were here, and are arguably species of horse, which is a very controversial topic. But my one of my mentors has done a lot of research in that area, and also I feel like I'm forgetting. Oh, deer and elk, of course. So this would be part of feeding your food. You know, part of being reciprocal is like, okay, these deer, these buffalo, these sheep, they are feeding our bodies. So let us take care of the meadows so that they in turn can be fed. So the fire was actually really important for maintaining grasslands. Without fire, you have what you see today, which is 200, 300 trees per acre, all fighting for this limited nutrients, sunlight, and water, which creates really unhealthy forests. Whereas if you space the trees, not only do you prevent the disease from spreading through the trees, but you have a few healthy trees versus a lot of sick trees. It's the same reason you would thin your garden. If you plant a row of carrot, you don't just want 500 carrots growing in a meter. You know, you're going to thin it out and make sure there's only one carrot per area where a carrot can grow. So similarly, we would thin the forests and burn in between the trees. And burning was so important that it even features in our lunar calendars. So the Miamia Nation is indigenous to what we now call the Ohio River Valley, and they have a lunar calendar, and their September moon is called the grass burning moon. So this moon is basically the moon where everyone goes out and burns the grasses. And it's the lunar calendars often are our guides. They teach us what to do and when. And they're things that have been developed over thousands and thousands of years on the land. So if you want to dip into indigenous land management to inform U.S. fish and wildlife, you might take a look at the lunar calendars of the local area. They're not all the same. Each nation has a different lunar calendar, but they are often guides for how to manage the land. So the grass burning moon is an indication of how important burning was to tribes, and they're not the only nation with a grass burning moon. Lots of different nations in the southeast, in the east, in the Midwest, in California, pretty much everywhere we burned this whole continent. Um, was having some type of grass burning moon or season where we knew it was time to burn. So this is in September, our Gregorian September. So they've done a lot of beautiful publications, the Miamia Nation. One thing they said was in Sashakalyoquilswa, which is the grass burning moon, we see fire as something that restores and gives new life to the prairie. Fire helps clear the land of old grass and brush and opens seed pods that have fallen to the ground. Because of fire, new plants, new flowers and plants emerge in the spring. So fire clears the land, it nourishes the land with ash. It has like a reverse albedo effect where it actually heats up the soil. It stimulates microbial activity. Ultimately, it will increase the water filtration rate of the soil so the soil is more spongy and will soak in that rain rather than having it run off. It also opens pyroadapted seeds like echinacea, for example, is one of those medicine plants that thrives after fire. So a lot of these ecosystems were fire adapted, adapted to our fire. This is a great book, Forgotten Fires. If you haven't read it, I think it should be required reading for all land management agencies in the United States and beyond. It just talks about how important fire was for upholding these systems. And on the right hand side, we see buffalo munching on some grass that would not be there without consistent and persistent and routine burning of the grasslands. So a lot of people envision Native Americans chasing the buffalo, hunting the buffalo with a bow and arrow, da da da. But actually, we weren't following the buffalo as much as the buffalo were following our fire. The buffalo followed us as we expanded their ecosystems as far east as Pennsylvania, as far south as Louisiana. Um, so yeah, related to that, going into the south, the cane ecosystems, the bamboo ecosystems, these also were managed by fire because this middle picture, if you let the bamboo go on its own, this indigenous bamboo species, which was so important for the material culture, make baskets out of it, arrows, flutes, rafts, architecture. Bamboo was such a versatile plant, and they could use it to make so many things. But if it all grows in a clump like this, it actually will choke itself out, and it needs something to knock it down, to open the canopy, let the light in, to keep them from all absorbing all the water. So it's really important to constantly burn the cane or harvest it in some manner, and it depended on human management to keep it going, or else it would collapse into itself. So one of the ways they would open up the canopy was burning the bamboo. So the human fire would burn the cane, which would actually proliferate the cane. Cane is one of those things when you burn it, it just grows back more and grows back stronger. And then the cane would actually feed those buffalo that are coming down all the way into southern Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. We don't often think of buffalo being there, but the Muskogee Nation, who is indigenous to Alabama, actually has buffalo songs, buffalo dances, buffalo ceremonies. Buffalo is a huge part of the buffalo of the southeast culture, and that buffalo belt goes all the way from Alaska down into Mexico and Florida. So we have to really break open our conception of where buffalo were in this continent. So yeah, the bamboo would feed the buffalo would feed the humans would feed the bamboo fire, and this cyclic process of creating forage for the buffalo, just like pandas, they like to eat it. And of course, the byproduct of all that was a stabilized soil system and a nutrient dense soil system that was nourished by that ash. So I could go on, but I don't have too much time. Here's the oyster fishery of this Washington, D.C. area, Virginia, Maryland area. Chesapeake Bay is the Smithsonian Insider published that ancient Native American methods may be key to sustainable oyster harvests. And that's something we've been saying all along. But, once the Smithsonian publishes it, it becomes credible. So whatever, we'll take what we can get, whatever helps the world listen to us. And if we need, Western scientists to say it in their own way, go for it. We just know that there's a crisis on our hands, and if you would let us manage the land, we will help it thrive. So these are an example of the oyster middens that have been researched, radiocarbon dated, measured their size, and they found that over 3,000 years, not only was there never a pause in people harvesting these oysters, eating them, and depositing it into these middens, but the oysters actually grew in size. So native people took care of that. And like I said, within 300 years, US management has managed to destroy this oyster fishery down to less than 1% of its original size. So the Chesapeake oyster is now a rarity. The Heiltsuk indigenous herring roe farmers are really interesting too in Canada and British Columbia, above Vancouver on the west side. They dip hemlock boughs such as this, as well as plant kelp in the coastal zone, so that when the herring, this little silver fish, comes along, they have more surface area to lay their eggs. So it was really important for humans to feed this surface area to the herring so that they can lay more and more and more eggs. And so when you harvest the hemlock, all of these eggs are plastered on there, and it's a very nutritious, very delicious, and very important food source for them. But also, it's an important food source for the orca, for the salmon, for the wolves and the bears, for the up the food chain to the eagles. You know, this egg actually starts their entire lunar calendar is when the herring come. That is so important to their whole food system, that this is what they start their calendar with in February, March, is when the herrings swim in and lay their eggs. So very cool. They also will plant these kelp forests, fast growing giant kelp, in the coastal zone as well, to attract herring and to give, more um, surface area for them to lay their eggs. And this is called spawn on kelp. It's a delicacy. It's delicious. I got to try it. Okay, where did oh yeah, so that's that, and it's a non-human centric food system. Really important for our land management techniques to not be about serving humans, but about serving the larger food web. This is the last example I have. It's the Mebungokre Kayapo soil management techniques, also known as the Amazonian dark earths. So all of this black loamy soil on the left is completely due to human hands. This would not be here if relatives like this and his family and his ancestors hadn't had done their very innovative composting, burning, and ceramic deposition techniques to create this soil system. And you have soils that are up to 3-4 feet deep of topsoil ready to be planted, uh, living living soil, not sandy dead earth. And it turns out that, pardon me, it turns out that Amazonian soils are actually very nutrient poor. They are not places you want to grow crops. And it took a lot of human intervention to make the Amazon as fertile as we imagine it today. On the right hand side, you can see all these black dots. These are places where we find Amazonian dark earths. And look at the size of this square when you look at the South American map. I mean, this is a huge chunk of South America. This is like a fourth of the entire continent. And look how much land that human beings have impacted and influenced to be much more fertile. So what you find is human influence being extremely important in the Amazon, and actually responsible for the fertility and the lusciousness of the Amazon River Basin as we know it, being in part an anthropogenic human creation. To me, that's just mind blowing. And I think that's what we at US Fish and Wildlife would want to aspire to. We would want to get to a point where we are so good to the earth that we actually make things better wherever we go. We're making things thrive, we're making things more biodiverse, we're making the soil more happy. And these guys prove that it is possible. Um, so that's just a really important soil management system that I think we can all learn from. Oh, I forgot to mention how they do it. So the way that they create these soil systems is through very diverse and persistent inputs, meaning lots of ash, lots of organic debris from their crops, termite mounds that are no longer in operation, any organic stuff you can create. A lot of slash and burn, those slash hole areas, let the vegetation dry and then burn it. Um, and they'll do rotational slash and burn, which is not a primitive practice at all. It is extremely effective and extremely influential in augmenting fertile soil bases for a whole ecosystem. There's all kinds of things you could say about rotational slash and burn, but it is not a cute little Indian thing. This is like extremely important and extremely supportive um, um, soil management technique. And so also they put their ceramics in there. When the pots are done, they'll put the broken shards, and I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, is for water retention and water absorption, so that the soil has that in there. I'm still learning exactly what the ceramics did. If someone knows, feel free to put it in the chat. So anyways, I love this system. It's very beautiful. Some main takeaways are habitat expansion, reciprocity, holistic landscape scale management instead of tiny parcels. That these are millennial scale. These are, everything I've shown you is at least 1,000 years old, with the exception of the floodplain in Bolivia. But they might have been more 1,000 years too. We just don't have the radiocarbon dating yet. They're consent and free will based. You're not trapping animals. You're actually creating a home for animals, and they will come to you. There's a stewardship mentality, really seeing ourselves as warriors for the earth, warriors for our mother, warriors who will fight for her at all costs. That's a very different than a profiteer mentality, right? Like, how much can I get out of this for myself? It's just like, to us, like, it's just a completely insane mentality. We never understood it. We probably never will. So the recommendations of a regional food shed cooperative, collapsing our individual land holdings into larger holistically managed food sheds, honoring the ancestral diets of every American. What they need to eat is not all the same. Everyone's different with different DNA. Pilot projects, really ensuring that we don't have time to boil the ocean. We don't have time to prove this in the whole world, but we do have time to do small projects that can prove these techniques do work and study their effect on the land. Honoring local indigenous species instead of replacing them. And of course, land back, returning land to the supervision of indigenous peoples, not so much the tribal governments, which are just as much part of the United States government oftentimes as Washington, D.C. is, but actually to grassroots individuals, grassroots people, usually women, who know this knowledge and know how to take care of the land properly, which oftentimes the tribal governments don't remember how to do. They're too busy trying to play the colonial game to know. So when we say land back, we don't necessarily mean to the tribal government, although sometimes that can and does work, but oftentimes giving it to grassroots organizations and grassroots leaders. So the goal is to really see this land as Turtle Island, a densely populated, extensively managed continent, instead of America, a terra nullius virgin land until Europeans showed up. So that's really the narrative we're trying to shift, is that, this is a whole system, and it used to be densely populated and extensively managed by our peoples in sustainable ways that we could all learn from today. So thank you all so much for letting me talk at you for quite a few minutes and quite a long time. I know we don't have much time left for Q&A, but we might have time for one question or a comment.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Now we're going to move to see if the audience has any questions. You can enter them into the chat. As you were speaking, I thought of a question. You kind of answered it, though, with your slide about recommendations. But since many of those in the audience work for a land management agency, and some of us have adopted using seasonal burning called prescribed burning, is there any other technique you could think of that we should consider?
Oh yes, and it really depends on the biome and the bioregion. You know, what works in Wisconsin is not going to work in Arizona. What works in, Washington D.C. is not going to work in Maine or Connecticut. Not going to work in Florida. So it's very site specific. Um, but I mean, in addition to, let's talk about Wisconsin. You know, maybe there's some controlled burning being revitalized there. I think in addition to controlled burning, the really the selecting of tree species that are supportive both of human nutrition and also of the ecosystem at large. So for example, sometimes there's certain oak species that other animals really depend on. You know, how can we be selective about the types of trees that we are privileging when we're thinning the forest, when we're burning, making sure that the trees that we are selecting are really contributing not only to human nutrition and human health, but also to the health of the entire environment. Um, are we, as we're burning the forest, are we also considering maybe privileging native species and maybe thinning out invasive ones, or even some species, like if you read my dissertation, which I'll put in the chat here, one of the interviewees said that even native species can be invasive. You know, they might be native, but they're acting in a way that prevents biodiversity. They're acting in a way that prevents people from, or rather certain species, to be able to have any space or room. There's the dissertation in the chat. So, you know, in addition to burning, like, how do we select? You know, indigenous peoples were incredible and still are incredible geneticists. You know, they really worked to, like, for example, the salmon. When the salmon run comes through, going upstream, you're not going to take the first salmon. You're going to let those ones swim because those are the fastest and the strongest. So they made it up first. You're going to take the last salmon to eat. And in that manner, over thousands of years, they actually influenced the genetic composition of the salmon because they're kind of culling, if you will, the slower salmon. And that's part, like, the strength and longevity and resilience and beauty of American salmon, possibly in part owe their strength to indigenous selectivity. um okay, I see a question here. um what are your thoughts on one of the next steps we can or should do to move this topic forward, either at the personal, state, federal level? Um, I would say that we would want to put indigenous peoples, well, okay, let me back up. Number one is we need to build capacity within indigenous communities. What I know today, I did not know 5 years ago. I actually was educated on this by my elders. And I am shocked at the level of miseducation even I had as an indigenous person, the level of not knowing what my ancestors were. And when I did find out, it was so exciting to be like, whoa, my people did this. I even drank the Kool-Aid thinking we were primitive cavemen. And so building capacity within indigenous communities, because the land back is rolling. They are giving land back by the hundreds of acres right now every day. Are we going to be ready as indigenous peoples to manage that land? And it's hard for us to do that when the boarding school system destroyed all of our traditional ecological knowledge, not all of it, but a lot of it. So we have to reteach our own people. That's number one. Number two is the folks who are educated in the traditional manner, in the traditional management practices, who have this deeper nuanced knowledge, they need to be put in places of leadership and decision making over what happens over huge swaths of land, including national forests, including national parks, and give us a chance. Get, like, let us have the wheel for like 10 years, like they're doing at Joshua Tree. I'm so excited about that. I know it's a small step, but I hope it leads to many more instances where indigenous peoples are co-managing national forests or just straight up managing it. Just give us 10 years. Let us show you what we can do. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, you can have it back. But let us at least have a chance as federal decision makers with federal positions to really to do our experiments and try to revitalize these techniques. Um, Okay, going to Levi. Thank you, Levi, as more of a comment than a question. Going to Larry, did you find any evidence of white oak expansion as chestnut blight was introduced? Uh, well, from what I understand, the chestnuts in the if I remember correctly, this is two questions in one, Larry. The second question of you think the blight came in the 1900s to wipe out the chestnuts? From if I remember correctly, this study said that in 1830, that's when this particular chestnut forest was no longer present in the fossil record. So why did all the chestnuts disappear in 1830 in Kentucky? I couldn't tell you exactly. I was assuming it was the blight, but maybe it was something else. Maybe indigenous peoples were wiped out and the management strategies weren't kept up, and that's how they, by the 1830s, a lot of indigenous folks were already dead. I would say the vast majority of indigenous folks in the southeast were wiped out. We don't think about that often as just how early things were wiped out before people even started writing history about us. We had already been, our original composition had already been shattered. Think about that even the what little records we have were written after a lot of the disease had already wiped us out. So anyways, okay, on to your first question on white oak expansion. I don't understand the question, actually. Maybe you could rewrite it. Did you find any evidence of white oak expansion as chestnut were, I think what you're saying, as chestnut were wiped out? I don't know, frankly. I am not an expert on the interplay between white oak and chestnut, but I appreciate the question because you're uh, getting the gears going in my mind. I do know that oak was obviously extremely important to indigenous folks. The white oak was, and so I would imagine that there could be some oak or even cedar or other plants that are more tenacious or voracious that could easily encroach on the chestnut. But I don't. I think that is definitely a possibility that um, uh, that not just oak but other species, especially pine, tend to crowd out when more fragile species like the chestnut are wiped out. Um, I wonder if the Joshua Tree could be examples. Absolutely, Joshua Tree, Bison Range could be examples. I think that definitely these are really important examples of co-management. Um, oh, I see. So Brittany's question: are there active examples of indigenous land management currently happening? Okay, yes. Can I please just share my screen for that, just because it's so exciting what's going on? Let me just do this, and I know we're probably running out of time, so feel free to cut me off at any time. But hold on one second. There it is. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen real quick. Um, okay, so this is a really awesome 1,000-acre project in Alabama. It's a language immersion eco village of the Muskogee Nation, who is indigenous to Alabama. They've brought buffalo back to Alabama. They've brought sturgeon back to Alabama. And they've brought their traditional lifeways back to Alabama. So they are also bringing their language back. As you can see, this is all written in Muskogee. So these guys are amazing. Oh, okay.
Yep.
Sorry, I didn't push the button. Okay, so this is 1,000 acres in Alabama. They've restored the sturgeon. They've restored the buffalo. They're just getting started. There's a couple kids. These two kids here are the only kids on Earth who speak Muskogee fluently. Uh, that's how vital this work is. Mind blowing. They've burned hundreds of acres of this area, um, and they're doing a lot of sustainable building and stuff. And there's some buffalo uh, video too that's not showing yet. Here's some of their greenhouse stuff and local food. Oh, this is the sturgeon aquaponics that they're doing. There hasn't been sturgeon in Alabama for like 100 years, so they're bringing that back. Um, aren't they beautiful? Um, so, anyways, it's a beautiful example. Another example is, I'm just kind of throwing stuff out there. Um, is the Amamutsan Land Trust. You know, they're in Santa Cruz, California, and they are trying really hard to bring their traditional stewardship practices back. So they have the Native Stewardship Corps. So they have Native youth and Native peoples basically working all around Santa Cruz to bring back the certain ecosystems and to burn. As you can see, they're preparing for a burn here. So those are a couple examples. There's no shortage of incredible examples, actually. Maybe just one more I'll show is um, the Salish Kootenai are bringing back their fire management pretty strongly. Uh, Here's a picture of a burn that's going on. So yeah, they're doing incredible work as well. I could go on and on with examples, but I'll stop there. There's an abundance of very inspiring things that Native folks are doing across the country.
Thank you so
And
much
yeah,
for
I'll
those
share that.
examples. Do you think yeah, share the links. Thank you. So I think
Yep.
we are now, that is all the time we have today for questions. If anyone else submits questions later, we will do our best to get answers to those and reach back out to you. And Lyla June, thank you again for sharing your time with us today. We truly appreciate you sharing your knowledge and insights on this subject matter. And for everyone else in our wonderful audience, we hope that you can all join us next month on Wednesday, August 16th at 3 p.m. Eastern for our next Indigenous Connections broadcast. As a reminder, each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. If you wish to learn more about this broadcast series or be added to the listserv, please email Jennifer Hill at Jennifer_Hill at fws.gov. And thank you for joining today.